I have a Pentax Super-Takumar 55mm f2 lens here that I'm going to be fully disassembling. This is a 1960s screw mount lens from Pentax, and it's the cheaper version of this lens. I believe they also made a 1.8 and a 1.4, very similar type of lens to this. This lens in particular has a slightly cheaper construction in some of the components. It's very easy to take apart, but certain things like how the indicators here are attached to the body, it's just a strip of metal that's literally glued onto the body. Things like that are a little bit cheaper and can make repairs a little bit more annoying, but it is a repairable lens that you can take apart pretty easily. I'm going to be getting access to the diaphragm blades, removing the optics, and also disassembling the body so that it can be repaired mechanically and cleaned as well. So we'll start off here on the front of the lens actually, because this lens you really have to disassemble everything from the front. There's not a whole lot you can actually do besides remove the back optical piece here on the back side of the lens. So I'll focus out and then grab the top black section here, which contains both the name ring and then this outer black ring that holds the filters, and just unscrew that. Right, and now I've exposed the front optic here. And the next step is to actually remove this front optic. You can see that there are two little divots for a spanning wrench in this inner black ring over here. So one here and then one here. So we'll use those to actually undo this front optical piece. Alright, so there's the front optical piece here. This can actually be further disassembled. I believe it's using adhesive here to actually hold together some of these different rings. But you can actually go and try to unscrew these if you need to clean inside. But now we have access to the front of the diaphragm here. You can see that this copy has a slight bit of rust over here, but it's not really affecting operations, so it's probably not even worth messing with at this stage. Now to actually get access to the entire diaphragm, let's say it had like a lot of oil on it or something, and you need to clean it more thoroughly, then it's very easy on this lens to do that. So we can actually remove the entire diaphragm mechanism without going in from the back of the lens. There's this, up on this stack in here, on the inside of the lens, there's this black ring on the top, which has two little divots for a spanning wrench on either side. That's what's actually holding in the diaphragm. So I'll use a spanning wrench in those two divots to actually undo the black ring and then slide out the diaphragm. Alright, so there's that black ring. Now I can just lift the entire inner diaphragm mechanism out, like that. And it has the back optic on there as well. So just remove this back optical piece as well. At this stage you can really just unscrew it, but it does have two little divots for a spanning wrench on either side. And separate that back optic. It can be disassembled much like the front optic can. Now we've exposed the diaphragm on both sides here. I'm not actually going to be taking apart this diaphragm because you can actually clean it pretty well in its current state. But you can see that there's this black plate on the top of the diaphragm right here. And then there are these little screws on the side here that are actually holding in that black plate. So you could undo those screws, lift off the black plate, and then disassemble the diaphragm if you really need to clean it pretty well. But usually you can clean it well enough in its current state. So just set that aside. And now returning back to the main lens body here. As I mentioned, this lens you really have to go in from the front to disassemble it. So now we actually want to remove these body sections in here. And the only way to do that is going in through the front of the lens some more. So first off we have this focusing ring that you actually grip onto right here. And the focusing ring is held in place by three little screws down in this ring over here. They're recessed pretty far down and this gap is not too wide, so you'll need a fine tip screwdriver to actually undo these. Alright, so just lift that out of place. That can be cleaned on its own, and now we've exposed the first parts of the focusing mechanism down here. So actually grab the focusing mechanism, you can see there it is. Just focus back in for a moment. Next up we want to actually remove the aperture control ring and these other two body sections in here and expose those so that those can be cleaned. And finally we're going to actually want to remove the mechanical pieces on the back here so that if there are any problems with those could also be maintained. So the first step is removing this ring right here, which has the aperture control indicator or the focusing indicator right here, which is indicating the current focusing position through this little window. And that just is held in place by three little slotted screws going around on the exterior here. You don't need to remove these screws fully, you can actually just loosen them up and then this piece will slide out of place. So this can be cleaned on its own, it's just a thin metal strip. Now we can actually see one of the more annoying parts of this lens, which is this ring right here, which on my copy, when I originally took it apart, this little metal ring with the indicators of your current focusing distance, it just is glued in place here. It's just a really thin metal strip that's glued around the circumference of this ring and the focusing mechanism right on the inside. And because the glue is so old, it's likely that if your copy has not been repaired before, that the glue will actually not really hold it in place anymore. So you may have to add some adhesive back to actually hold it in place. And another thing that can happen is that if the glue has dissolved or is not holding up anymore, when you actually focus back and forth, this ring on the inside can actually turn when it should really remain stationary. So that's one thing that can happen. And you do have to be careful when cleaning this ring then that you don't dissolve the adhesive underneath it if you're trying to keep it preserved. So now we'll actually remove the aperture control ring right here. The aperture control ring has the ball bearing in it. It is right over here near the numbers, so we have to be careful not to lose that. So first off, I'll just push up the aperture control ring, and now it's kind of stuck right at this point right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate it over a little bit until, so the ball bearing itself is like right around the infinity indicator right now. I'm going to rotate this around until I can get the last part of the little notches in here on the aperture control ring over where the ball bearing is, and this will allow me to slide off the ball bearing and the aperture control ring safely. So there the ball bearing kind of flew out of the way, but the ball bearing is right here. It normally rests in this little pit right here, and the aperture control ring can be cleaned on its own now. And finally, to actually separate the back section of the lens and the mounting plate from the focusing mechanism here, we have these 3 screws that were covered up before going around here on the body. So undo these 3. Now these 2 sections just slide apart like that. So we have the focusing mechanism here, and then the back mounting plate, and then all the mechanical pieces here on the back section. So this is where some problems may occur. You can see that we have the little lever here, the stop down lever, over on the side. It switches to manual focus or the automatic focus, and then we have this stop down lever back here on the back section. They're all just controlling this black metal piece in here, which is then getting coupled into the aperture control ring. So I'll explain that a little bit more during the reassembly and how things are getting coupled together. But if there's friction in this piece, or maybe one of these little springs has worn away or is snapped or is lost, you may have to try to repair this piece as well. I'm not actually going to disassemble this, but it can be repaired pretty well in its current state. So now we have the entire lens here pretty much fully disassembled. You can see that it's not too complex. There's just a lot of different rings and things that I have to go into here. But for the most part, it's all high quality metal components, besides that one little annoying ring here, which is metal, but it's a very annoying setup if it does become loose on your copy of the lens. So we have the optics here, which can be further disassembled, separate from the focusing mechanism here, separate from the mechanical parts, and then separate from a lot of the different body rings, which can be cleaned on their own pretty safely. And the diaphragm can also be further disassembled or cleaned pretty well in its current state as well. So now starting here on the reassembly, the first thing we're going to do is actually get the mechanical section back onto the diaphragm. The reassembly is pretty easy for the most part. There's nothing too tricky about it. It's just making sure that everything lines up properly. So for these 2 sections here, you have the back section mounting plate, and it has this little lever or bar right over here on this side of the mounting plate, over by the black lever thing that's kind of on the outside of the ring here. And that actually has to get lined up with, on the focusing mechanism here, there's a little cutout in this section. So those 2 have to get lined up, and then there are the 3 screw holes on these two sections that have to get lined up as well. But out of the three positions you can reattach it, you need to have it lined up so that the cutout over here is aligned with the little bar on that section. Okay, and then we'll reattach it using the 3 screws going around. Alright, so next up we're actually going to reinstall the aperture, and this will just help understand how things are getting coupled together. You can actually do this at a much later stage, but it will help illustrate how things are getting coupled together, and it is a little bit easier sometimes to do it now when there aren't as many pieces in place. So on the diaphragm piece right here, we have this bar on the back section that actually controls the diaphragm. Then it also has these 2 little kind of flat sections over on either side of the diaphragm. And then on the diaphragm, or on the main lens body right here, we have this little pocket down here on the black lever that was going back and forth. That's going to hook up into the bar right here and actually move the diaphragm back and forth. And then you'll notice there are also these 2 metal bars on either side right here. And as we focus in and out, those bars stay in place, but also lock the top section of the lens in place so it doesn't spin around. So those 2 flat sections on either side of the lens need to line up with those 2 metal bars right there. So to line this up, I'll find the side where the little lever needs to go, and then line up the 2 flat sections first with the 2 bars. Now I can just slide it into place, making sure that it goes through the little pocket of the lens, and maybe we have to rotate it back and forth a little bit to find the correct line up for the flat sections there. It should go flat. Okay. And now to just lock that down in place, we have the black ring that goes on the top here and has the 2 grooves for a spanning wrench on either side. So now we can actually get the aperture control ring back in place. And this is why I reinstalled the aperture at this stage instead of later, because it helps to see how things are getting coupled together. So on the outer part of the lens, there's this little groove here with a kind of a screw thing sticking up through that. And you'll notice then when I move this back and forth, it actually controls the aperture. So the aperture control ring is going to hook onto this little screw. But the complication of this is that we also have to line up the ball bearing correctly. It's going to be a little bit of a challenge. So the ball bearing is going to go into this little pocket right here. And you'll notice that on the aperture control ring, it has these little grooves over to the side, and there's one slightly larger groove at the end. That one is what's actually going to lock over the screw. But to actually get this in place, because the aperture control ring is pretty stiff, you have to do things in the correct order to make sure things line up. So first off, I'm going to put the ball bearing in place in the little pocket right there. And now I'm going to find the correct orientation of the aperture control ring and find where that slightly larger groove is. So it's over here by the 16 indicator. I'm going to line up that slightly larger groove with the ball bearing itself and then push this down on top of the ball bearing, making sure that it keeps things lined up. Okay, so now it's on top of the aperture control ring, and now I'm going to rotate over slightly. So if I actually rotate at this stage, it will click because the ball bearing is on the grooves there. And now the gap where the ball bearing went over is actually lined up with the little screw right here. So it needs to get pushed down on top of that as well. So there we go. And if you did everything correctly, now the diaphragm should, let me put that back in automatic mode or manual mode. Now the diaphragm should open and close and have the clicking sound as you do that. So now we have the body section here with the focusing indicator that just goes on top of that, and it just slides in place. You can actually find the correct position for this. So right now it's focused at the minimum focusing distance, and it's at f16 right now, so the minimum aperture. So there's no correct way to really lock this down, but you can find where the indicator is pointing at like the correct focusing distance and indicating the correct aperture here, and then lock it down in that position. And you want to make sure that it's pressed, this ring is pressed all the way down so it won't interfere with the focusing when we install that component in a second. So I'll reattach the 3 slotted screws going around this body section. You can adjust this later too if you find out you did not attach it in the right position. Right, so that it has that all set. It's a little bit hard to actually rotate this correctly now. It should be able to rotate this back and forth and have the little indicator stop at the minimum focusing distance, 0.45 meters here, and then the maximum focusing distance as well when you're focusing it. And the aperture indicator right here should also roughly line up with where things are getting focused. Next up, we'll just reinstall the actual focusing ring. So the focusing ring has the 3 screws going around on the interior here. Because the gap where you actually need to screw these into place is so small, it's a lot easier if you install the screws first and just have them set in place, and then you actually go back and then try to screw them in. So that's what I've done here. And now I'll just find the 3 screw holes on the top section of this piece going around and line this up. The orientation does not matter as long as the screws are lined up correctly. And actually go back in now and tighten these down. And one thing that can go wrong, which has actually gone wrong on my copy of the lens right here, is that focusing after you reinstall this piece may be very stiff. And what's actually happened here is that the focusing mechanism, the top section, is hitting up against the top section of this ring with the indicators here. So over here, right on this side, right above the screw, actually, you can see that there's actually no gap right now between these 2 pieces. And there's a slight gap on the bottom right here, and that's just because I did not correctly install this piece with the aperture control indicators. But it's easy to fix. All you have to do is loosen up this piece right here slightly, and then you may have to loosen up a couple of screws. Okay, and then nudge it down a slight bit, and then screw it back into place again. Now the focusing should be much more smooth. And again, if you find that the indicators are not lining up properly, once you get the lens fully reassembled, you can always loosen it up, even in its fully assembled state, spin this ring around and readjust things. So now all that's left is to reinstall the optics here. So we have the front optic, it just screws in place. And I'll use a spanning wrench on the 2 divots on the exterior here to actually lock this piece down. And then while we're reattaching things on the front, we may as well install the name ring and the filter ring holder here, which also just screws in place. And finally, have the back optical piece right here, which also just screws in place in the back of the lens. You can actually reinstall this during the reassembly of the diaphragm. You just put it in the diaphragm and then when you're reinstalling it. But you do have a slight bit more risk of then damaging the optic during the reassembly, so I tend to like to leave it off until the very last moment possible. And now we'll use the spanning wrench to actually lock down these 2. Right, so that has the lens completely reassembled now. You can make sure that everything is working properly, that you can focus, that the aperture control is working in the 2 different modes you have, manual and auto, and then it's all looking good. Overall, this is an earlier lens, so it does use the more solid metal construction that is easier to repair. Because it's one of the cheaper earlier lenses, though, there are a few annoyances, like the little indicator ring here just being a strip of metal that's kind of glued in place. But those are pretty minor, and there aren't that many components to the lens, so I would say that this is a very repairable lens that's easy to take apart and repair on your own.